I am Sid Dobrin from the Department of English at the University of Florida, and I am a USF Bull. Graduated from USF with my PhD back in way back in 1994, and very honored to be here. So we were asked to, in the keywords program, to come up with a keyword that is influential to us in Blue Humanities and the research we do in Blue Humanities. And I'm going to kick things off by talking about one of my favorite terms, fish. I am a lifelong saltwater angler. I am very active in the recreational sport fishing industry. I want to talk about fish today as a term, but I'm going to talk about it in a kind of a different way. I'm not going to talk about fishing in the recreational sense, and I'm not going to talk about fish from the biological sense, except in a couple of offhanded ways. So my keyword for the panel today is fish. And the moment I use that term, there is instantly what we have to recognize as an ontological ambiguity of what we mean by fish. Because that term fish, particularly when we look globally, is such a different, it's not a discrete biological term. The word fish gets used for lots of different species of lots of different kinds of animals and organisms. And when I say fish, we start to realize that particularly in US culture, but globally, we tend not to think of fish as individual, more than human agents. We tend to think of fish in larger kinds of harvest language. So for instance, if we take cultural representation of, let's say, the blue crab, which gets listed as a type of shellfish, that then when we start looking at harvest numbers gets thrown into that larger aggregate of fish and fishing. But if we start to look at harvest numbers, say for the blue crabs, in the United States, we harvest roughly 45 to 61 million pounds of blue crab every year. But that's how it's counted, is in pounds. If we take that and the average size of a blue crab and we start thinking about individual organisms, that's roughly 450 million individual organisms that we're taking from saltwater, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay, and certainly around here as well from the Gulf. Now, all of a sudden, we have another way of thinking about those individual specimens. And once we start thinking about individual fish, we run into another trap of both the legal and cultural representations of fish. So for instance, in 2022, the UK put forward some legislation, a piece of legislation called the UK Animal Welfare Sentience Law, and recognizes now crustaceans like crabs and lobsters, and also certain kinds of mollusks as being sentient beings. And that certainly then changes how we think of these animals legally and culturally as not just being tons of food that we bring in, but individual organisms. And the moment we do that, we have to start thinking about the biopolitics of the body of individual fish or anything that falls under that rubric. So if we then, within a framework of Blue Humanities, draw on the work in critical animal studies in particular, we can see that fish is often reduced to what Carrie Wolf has called bare life, Zoe. And that then means that it changes how we manage and optimize those biological entities strictly for human use. So once we start thinking about fish are really seen culturally and economically as attending to human need, we can start talking about things through Blue Humanities like blue economy. And that's the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, for improved livelihoods and jobs, while supposedly maintaining the health of the ocean ecosystem. I tend to find that term to be a kind of greenwashing, however, that it's just another way to harvest resource and claim that you're doing it sustainably. And of course, we see that, and we see that particularly here in the Gulf region, with campaigns like Wild Harvest, which actually was launched over here at St. John's Pass, or Wild Caught Seafood. These campaigns were used to promote a kind of sustainability ethos, but really to command premium prices on seafood and addressing those high levels of bycatch that we can then push aside as it's okay to take bycatch as long as we're wild harvesting. So if we look at recent data, for instance, in terms of global fisheries and aquaculture production, we're now taking about 223.2 million tons of aquatic organisms every year out of the water. It's a value of about $472 billion. But there are a lot of cultural shifts that influence that. So historically, the US, the EU, and Japan dominated harvest of fish. Back in 1961, about half of all things taken out of the water came to those three divisions. But as of last year, we're now seeing that those three areas have dropped to 18% of the outtake, while China, Indonesia, and India now consume over 50% of all the harvested fish. So that then starts to make all these kinds of connections within Blue Humanities interrogations. So we can look at protein source breakdown. Most of the protein that we take out of the ocean is in the form of fin fish, 65% of that. 23% are those crustaceans I talked about, and 11% are mollusks. So this then creates what we also have to look at in terms of what I'm working with in my current research is the conflict over blue protein. Who has access to our protein? And a lot of this then ties into what's called IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, particularly when we start looking at places like China and their distant water fleet, which then creates for us in Blue Humanities this paradox. And it's protein versus agency. Which becomes more predominant, the human need for ocean-driven protein or the agency of those individual organisms? So right now, seafood provides about 3.1 billion people with 20% of their daily protein needs. But when we look at small island nations, what we recognize is that those nations are dependent on the oceanic protein sources because they have no place for land-based agriculture. So when we then start looking at these kinds of ethical conflicts of which is more important, the sustainability of the ocean or the sustainability of the people, we start through Blue Humanities recognizing the primacy of the human that plays a role in how we understand what fish are. It really creates this dynamic between hunger and interiority. So if we look at places like Senegal or Haiti, the immediate need for survival really eclipses the need for over the concern of animal agency or more than human agency. And when we start taking that kind of concept and bringing it into a framework of environmental justice and global conflict, now we start to look at all of those moments of illegal exploitation. So if we look, for instance, at the Chinese distance water fleet, we can start to see a couple of things happening globally. So if you look at the official Chinese statistics, they claim that they've got anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 ships, vessels that go out of their waters into the rest of the waters in the world to extract fish. But if you look at the independent research, we're actually seeing estimates now that the Chinese distant water fleet has as many as 17,000 vessels that are going around the world harvesting fish, both inside and outside of other sovereign nations' economic zones. So if we look historically, and we can trace this back to the 1200s, there is conflict over who gets to harvest. So the Chinese distance water fleet, and the other example I want to throw in here real quick as I wrap this up, is we've all seen on the news about the ghost boats in the South China Seas, where the Filipino boats are found washed up with all the fishermen dead because they're having to go farther out than their boats are capable of because the Chinese distance water fleets are harvesting everything from their waters. So this then entangles Blue Humanities, not only with environmental justice, but also in terms of maritime law, human rights violations. And I'll wrap this up by saying when we start looking at those human rights violations, we have to recognize that right now in the history of humankind, we see more slavery than we have at any other moment in history. And the majority of that slavery is being enacted by the industrial fishing, distant water fleets and other boats, particularly the shrimping industry in Indonesia. And so now we have a whole nother issue of unpaid labor and human trafficking that ties into how do we understand what it is to say this is a fish.